Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the new MPI-MMG in Dialogue event. This is the second in the new series of events that discuss innovative research approaches and concepts, and is hosted by the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity here in Göttingen. Today's event is organized by the Max Planck Research Group, Empires of Memory, the Cultural Politics of Historicity in Former Habsburg and Ottoman Cities. So I would like to greet both our live audience, which is somewhat limited in number due to current COVID regulations, as well as our online audience, which is larger. We are happy that you're here, and we wish we could greet more of our online participants here in person, which I hope will be the case in the next In Dialogue events. We have titled today's event, Sanitizing Imperial Pasts. Today, when the empire is again on all our minds, we will be talking about different ways we remember the imperial pasts and the way these memories are revisited, shunned, flexed, adorned, interrogated, or sanitized for the political purposes in the present. We will talk about the genre and media, particularly important as our guests today are art historians, through which such memories are shaped. And these questions about how and why we remember empires and imperial pasts have shaped the work of our group, Empires of Memory, over the period of 5 years which we've spent here at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. This event today is the concluding event for our group, so it is a nostalgic occasion, but it is also a celebration of sorts, and we've been very fortunate and privileged to be able to invite 2 external guests for this occasion, which I will present in a moment. And Dr. Jeremy Walton, our research group leader, will provide more information on the activities and achievements of our research group in this 5-year period. So I will briefly present our 4 panelists today, starting with the 2 guests. Professor Wendy Shaw publishes on the impact of coloniality and Eurocentrism on art-related institutions, heritage and preservation, modern art and pre-modern discourses of perception, and religious thought under secular modernism. Her work focuses on Ottoman Empire, modern Turkey, and regions of Islamic hegemony. She's the author of several books: Possessors and Possessed, Museum Archaeology and the Visualization of History in the Late Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Painting, Reflections of Western Art from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, What is Islamic Art? Between Religion and Perception, the book that received the honorable mention for the 2020 Albert Hourani Award of the Middle East Studies Association, as well as the 2021 Iran Book Award, and most recently, Loving Writing, Techniques for the University and Beyond. Professor Matthew Rampli is Extraordinary Professor of Art History at Masaryk University in Brno. His research focuses on the cultural politics of art and education in Central Europe from the mid-19th century. His books include The Museum Age in Austria-Hungary, Art and Empire in the Late 19th Century, and Liberalism, Nationalism, and Design Reform in the Habsburg Empire, Museums of Design, Industry, and the Applied Arts, both co-authored with Markian Prokopovic and Nora Vespremi. The Seductions of Darwin, Art, Evolution, Neuroscience, the Vienna School of Art History, Empire and the Politics of Scholarship, and the Remembrance of Things Past on A.B.M. Warburg and Walter Benjamin. Among his edited volumes are Art, History and Visual Studies in Europe, Transnational Discourses and National Frameworks, and Heritage, Ideology and Identity in Central and Eastern Europe. He leads the ERC-funded research group CRACE, Continuity/Rupture, Art and Architecture in Central Europe, 1918 to 1939 at Masaryk University. Those are our 2 guests, and now back to our own group members. Dr. Jeremy Walton is the leader of our research group, Empires of Memory, at the Max Planck Institute here in Göttingen. He's a cultural anthropologist whose research resides at the intersection of memory studies, urban studies, the comparative study of empires and imperialism, and critical perspectives on materiality. Dr. Walton received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. His first book, Muslim Civil Society and the Politics of Religious Freedom in Turkey, is an ethnography of Muslim NGOs, state institutions, and secularism in contemporary Turkey. He has published his research in a broad selection of scholarly journals, including American Ethnology, Sociology of Islam, Die Welt des Islams, History and Anthropology, and the Journal of the Ottoman Turkish Studies Association. He's also the co-editor of several volumes, including Anthropology and Global Counterinsurgency and Art and Politics in the Modern Period. And in April, already next month, he will inaugurate a new research group called Revenant Revivals of Empire, Nostalgia, Amnesia, Tribulation at the University of Rijeka. It is also an ERC project supported by ERC Consolidator grant. Our fourth panelist, Dr. Cicek Ilengis, is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Empires of Memory. Her academic interests lie at the intersection of national and imperial legacies of state violence, cultures of commemoration and healing, and imaginations of political change. Her recent publications engage with inheritance in the context of world heritage, temporal dimensions of public memorials, and dispossession in the name of culture. She completed her PhD in 2019 at the Research Center for History of Emotions, hosted by the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. She's currently revising her book manuscript, tentatively titled Magical Revolution, Holy Madness in Post-Genocidal Turkey, for publication. The book centers on the question of how to think about a revolutionary imagination that embraces supposedly backward and irrational. It offers a critical assessment of the logic of politics, the framework of which has been drawn by military, racial, and secularist regimes of power. So these are our four panelists. My name is Jelena Radovanovic. I am also a postdoctoral researcher at the Empires of Memory, and I'm a historian of Southeast Europe and late Ottoman Empire. So with this, I will leave the floor to Jeremy Walton, and after his brief presentation, we will start the panel. We will leave then the last section, last half hour, for the Q&A from the audience, both the live audience and the online audience, which can participate through the chat function. Our colleague Farhan Samanani will keep track of the online participation. So Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jelena. I guess I'm not mic'd here because I'm mic'd here. I'm going to be as brief as possible because really we are here today for a dialogue, so you probably don't need to listen to my monologue too long, but I do want to give you a sense of what we've been up to for the past 5 years as a way of framing our event today. Thank you again, Jelena, for that kind introduction. So just to briefly show you a few images and give you a sense of some of the overarching themes, concepts, sites, and arguments that have inspired and occasionally challenged, well, frequently challenged us. I like to begin with an image. Some of you may have already seen this image, of course, since I am fond of using images that quite nicely materialize and articulate the themes of the project. What you see here is a headdress that was a 19th century Bosnian headdress, in fact, on display at the Ethnographic Museum in Zagreb. So we'll be talking about museums a bit, the Post-Imperial Museum a bit later. And what's fascinating about it is that you can see, if you take a look, you have two different forms of currency in the headdress. You have both Ottoman kurush with the seal of the Sultan, and you have Habsburg thalers with the profile of Maria Theresa sort of rubbed off a bit, almost tessera, I think that's the word for that. But in a single object, you have this inter-imperial past, the borderlands of the Habsburg and the Ottoman empires, meeting together the looker of the empires, and yet it's also a post-imperial object taken to be representative. In this case, it was merely a part of an exhibition on, I think, headgear across Southeast Europe, it was called. But it stands in nicely for the themes of both the inter-imperial and the post-imperial, and really those are the two guiding analytics, if you will, that have inspired our group. So, just to give you a sense of the sites, and Jelena already gestured to this partially, but we are rooted in 8 different cities that span the terrain of Central Europe, Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and the Near East, and even indeed Central Asia to some extent. Vienna, Budapest, Trieste, Zagreb, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Thessaloniki, and Istanbul. Our different individual projects have intersected with these specific cities in various ways, and now at this rather nostalgic slightly melancholy concluding event for our group, I find myself already thinking about some of the oversights and absences in the work that we've done, but also the fantastic research conducted by each of our members. And I hope to have some time to discuss that with you as well at greater length today. On the map, you also see some smaller cities that were sites of secondary research. There should be even more there. This is a somewhat outdated image at this point. But suffice to say that we've ranged quite broadly across this terrain, even in the time of COVID. And I can't overstate my extreme gratitude for the other members of the group and the work that they've conducted. So conceptually speaking, our overarching goal has been to forge a vocabulary, a lexicon for talking about the way in which imperial pasts continue to persist in the present in a variety of ways. I see nodding heads in our audience here, so some of you will have heard me say some of these words before. We take inspiration from the notions of imperial formations and imperial legacies, imperial duress, from the anthropologist Laura Stoller. I should also mention the notion of the inter-imperial from the comparative theorist of comparative literature, Laura Doyle, has been quite influential. Imperial and imperialist nostalgia, thinking in tandem with Svetlana Boym and her wonderful work on restorative and reflective forms of nostalgia, as well as Renato Rosaldo, the anthropologist who much earlier drew a critique of anthropology as itself engaged in nostalgia for imperial frontiers and spaces that were quickly disappearing. For that matter, more recently, the anthropologist David Berliner and his notion of exonostalgia comes into play. The entire archipelago of concepts that you might think of as silencing, amnesia, erasure, oblivion, each of these associated with different thinkers, silencing with my own mentor Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, oblivion with the anthropologist Marc Auger, but in general an attention to the ways in which collective memories of empires also involve their own shadows and their own silences, erasures of the past that are ostensibly being remembered so vividly. Melancholy and ambivalence, of course, Sigmund Freud is the primary name here. The basic lesson here being that whether it's melancholy or ambivalence, two very closely related symptoms in Freud's analysis, one can maintain multiple and even contradictory emotional relations to a single object. And indeed, throughout the post-imperial terrains of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires, you find these multiple contradictory emotional relationships to the object of the bygone empire. Heterotopia and heterochrony from Foucault, again, calling attention to the ways that particularly in post-imperial spaces, you have multiple different places, multiple different times intersecting in unexpected and unintuitive ways. And finally, from Walter Benjamin, who really is in some sense the guru and sheikh of much of what we do, or at least much of what I do, I should only speak for myself, the notion of constellations between the present and multiple pasts, the argument against historicist images of the past, that really it's about how certain pasts relate to the present that determines how we experience and understand them. So that's, again, just to give you a sort of tasting menu of the conceptual palette. I'm mixing my metaphors, I realize, and we're going to talk about metaphors here today as well. But those are some of the theorists, thinkers, and concepts that have inspired us. We've had a total of 8 researchers on the project over the course of its 5.5-year tenure. And I'll just briefly talk about their individual projects, though Jelena Cicek and also Annika Kirbis is here in the audience. Jelena and Cicek are joining us in the panel. So Giulia Carabelli, who was a researcher, a postdoctoral researcher, focused on contemporary Habsburg-style coffee houses in a variety of cities, primarily Trieste, but also Vienna, Budapest, and Sarajevo, as sites of aestheticized, reflective nostalgia for the Habsburg Empire, and really quite beautifully drew in this sort of textures, tastes, and smells of those coffee houses as sort of affects of memory. I think that's how she called them. Cicek, I think I will allow you to talk about your own project at greater length, but very briefly, Cicek examines the various avatars of Jalaluddin Mevlana Rumi, the famous Sufi poet and mystic in contemporary Turkey, with a particular focus on how there are emerging what you might call underground and counter-memorial spaces of practice vis-a-vis Rumi that contradict the sort of more state-mediated images of the mystic. Miloš Jovanović, another postdoctoral researcher who was with us for 3 years, wrote about empires on the Danube, essentially examining the ways in which bourgeois 19th century forms of city planning traveled in an almost literal sense down the Danube from Vienna to Budapest and on to Belgrade and finally Russe in Bulgaria today, a sort of interesting take on Claudio Magris's famous notion of the Danube as a sort of fluvial and civilizational space. Jelena Radovanović, who is so generously moderating our panel, is conducting a project which I hope will continue in the afterlife of our project here, our research group, I should say. The institution of the Vakf, or the charitable foundation, the endowment, the charitable endowment in Islam, between memory and forgetting in Belgrade, Sarajevo, and Istanbul, particularly the post-imperial, post-Ottoman trajectories of the institution of charitable giving, often very central to the cityscape and the built environment in these cities, taking very different paths in post-Ottoman Turkey, post-Ottoman Bosnia, and post-Ottoman Serbia. Piero Regepi, another postdoctoral fellow who was with us for approximately 3 years, examined the ways in which empires, both the Ottoman and the Habsburg, are summoned to making multicultural arguments in Bosnia and Sarajevo particularly, though also in Thessaloniki in different ways, and the sort of whitewashing of more troubling pasts that went along with that summoning of a sort of multiculturalist image of the empires. Finally, myself, I am conducting, and I hope to be writing the book on it soon. I really should have done so already, but maybe COVID and other things intervened. A sort of project inspired in some ways by Pierre Nora's vast catalog of sites of memory in France, though with a very different political sensibility, I think. Constellations of Empire, examining how houses of worship, museums, monuments, cemeteries, and several other sort of archetypal spaces across these cities embody and defy imperial pasts in multiple ways. I think of it as a sort of phenomenological examination of sites of collective memory. And I say that with my tongue slightly in my cheek because, and this will sort of wrap things up, I think, for us very quickly, but as many of you know, here in Göttingen, the city is quite fond of commemoration, and you have these plaques on the wall. So just down the street here, you have, of course, the titan of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl. The fact that his house is now a Pilates parlor is particularly fascinating to me. Whereas down in the city center on Theodorstrasse, you have a commemoration of Maurice Halbwachs, who was also in Göttingen, if for a shorter time at some point. So indeed, inscribed on the built environment of the very city in which we are, you have the sort of forerunners of some of the inspirations for the projects that we're doing. I do want to say very briefly a few words about the futures of the project, at least as far as I'm concerned. Jelena kindly mentioned that I will be beginning an ERC-supported consolidator grant at the University of Rijeka in Croatia in only several weeks. It's rather difficult to believe. There are a variety of aspects of this project that are both extensions and expansions of empires of memory. We are expanding to include sites from the former Russian and Soviet empires, which, of course, as we will have the time to discuss later today as well, this is a moment in history that we're reckoning with the violence of empires past in new ways in Ukraine. But the heuristic for this project is examining post-imperial persons, places, and things. And I can say more about that, but I don't want to take up too much of my time. So this is just to give you a taster. That's graffiti depicting Gavrilo Princip, the assassin of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sofia, famously in June of 1914 in Sarajevo. That's in Belgrade. This is his famous quote when he was imprisoned in Theresienstadt. Our shadows will wander the palaces of Vienna and frighten the lords. This has almost become a sort of often repeated sort of cliche in its own right. Istanbul is one of the cities. I'll say more about this later. It's the column of commemorating a naval battle of Catherine the Great's Russia over the Ottomans in 1773 is the last one. But I would get into far too much detail if I took up any more of your time, and I shouldn't. Really, we're here for dialogue. So I thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for this summary and looking ahead as well. And I will pick up kind of where you stopped with the mentioning of the empires and their current relevance. So recent events, especially the wars in Syria and Ukraine, have put imperial pasts again on the central stage. And imperial legacies become sort of black boxes to explain contemporary political, social, cultural issues. As scholars with particular relationship to imperial archives, how do you interpret contemporary invocations of empire and their political consequences? And I suggest we start from the guests. Whoever of you would like to go first.
You go first. Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think, well, I would say this, the answer isn't simple. Because although on the one hand, we tend to think in terms of memory of empire in terms of a kind of reactionary politics of, let's call, you've mentioned sanitizing. But I think it's a little bit more complex than that, because I think it has different kinds of functions. And one of the things that I have noted in relation to certainly my own project, but even before that, in relation to Central Europe, how evocation of the Habsburg Empire served a number of different purposes, which was in a way to kind of challenge what themselves were problematic narratives. So that, for example, I'm based in Brno, in the Czech Republic, and for a long time, the Czech national identity has been, structured around a certain kind of narrative of national emancipation and so forth. And in Brno, which was until 1945, it was basically 40% of the population was German. That was just, somehow whitewashed. It just wasn't talked about, or it was just an embarrassing, feature. And of course, that was the same with so many cities, across what was Czechoslovakia. Until 93. And what I found quite interesting is how in the past decade or so there's been a return to revisiting that Habsburg past. There's even a brand of a food manufacturer in supermarkets called Franz Josef. You can get, it's made in somewhere in the Czech Republic. You can get Franz Josef sun-dried tomatoes if you want to, and various other things. But I think but that is coupled with a kind of revisiting, rethinking, what's the meaning of this place, which is about challenging a kind of received version of history, which was, after 1918, across Central Europe was dominated by nationalistic narratives that were, just as problematic as any, legitimations of empire. Similarly, I found it very interesting how in Ukraine, which obviously Jeremy talked about, there has been a great deal of interest in, particularly in Western Ukraine, in re-evoking and revisiting, memory of empire, because it's about, well, it serves a number of different ideological functions. One is about, obviously distancing themselves from the Soviet past, from Russia. And so, for example, about 10 years ago, there was a really big exhibition in Vienna about Galicia, Lviv and Chernovitz, now in Ukraine, of course, they all featured very prominently in there. And you can see there are research centers in Lviv which are all interested in, revisiting and picking up the pieces again of this imperial past, because it's a means of self-identification in the present. And even, what I find also interesting is that in the extreme west of Ukraine, in the sort of small triangle of land which between the two world wars was actually ruled by Czechoslovakia, Subcarpathian Ruthenia. In Uzhhorod, particularly, there's been this great deal of interest in revisiting and trying to promote the memory of being ruled by Czechoslovakia. And the reason I find that interesting is because within Czechoslovakia, or within the Czech Republic, there's been a lot of criticism about the way that Czechoslovakia functioned like a kind of mini empire between the wars, and that it adopted this kind of civilizing mission towards that part of its extreme backward eastern territory. And so I think it's quite interesting how imperial memories, invented imperial memories, that they're not necessarily, although in many cases, one can say, well, and I could even maybe even talk about, the case of Britain, where I'm originally from. It's very fraught, and it's often about a kind of whitewashing, or there's been certainly a kind of denial of what that meant. But at the same time, I tend to think, well, you do have to view each case in turn, because it's not necessarily in the service of a kind of reactionary politics of nostalgia. I think it's serving a variety of different motivations, which I can have a certain degree of sympathy for.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Wendy.
I think a lot of what I was thinking dovetails with what Matthew was saying, in that when we're thinking about the archive, we tend to think of something that exists for time immemorial. But the archive, in terms of the historical episteme, really emerges in the 19th century with the shift from a narrative historicism of Hegel towards a documentary historicism of Ranke. And I think in the documentary historicism of Ranke, one tends to forget the ways that has continued to the present. One tends to forget the way in which this use of documents and the ways in which we ask questions of documents are often informed by narrative processes that precede and exceed the documents. That is, we use the overall narrative to fill in the details between the bits of information that we have from archival evidence. And when I was doing my first dissertation research, I remember a feeling of that looking at documents was trying to figure out what people had for dinner by looking at what people talked about while having dinner by looking at the crumbs that were left on the table 100 years later. And that what I think has happened, or maybe is in the process of happening, I don't know, is that in the early 20th century, well into the late, let's say throughout the 20th century, there was increasing access to documents, particularly after the 1950s, an increasing interest in having open archives, the idea that information being present would lead to a kind of positive truth. And the thing is that, of course, one can hide documents, archives may claim to be open, not be open, and so on. But I think that in that faith, which is a faith, it's a belief system, there's a belief that if one has the evidence, then the truth will win out. And I think what's happening now is that we have the archives, they're open, one can use them, and those narratives aren't the narratives people want. And so what we have right now, particularly with this surfeit of narrativization and information that's enabled through the internet and commerce and all sorts of the various venues through which people access history, is that the archive has become this cute thing in the corner for historians to use, and the rest of the world has taken over playing tennis with narratives. And so the archive is really important, but I think that we need to articulate what's in that archive so that when people are buying, what was it, soap, Franz Josef soap, or whatever it was? Sun-dried tomatoes.
Yeah.
You know, there's something attractive in that. And I think that that attractiveness is the thing that the historians need to somehow figure out how to do in order to make it not just about access and information to the archive, but also the important part in the archive isn't only having access to the information, but being able to distribute that information. And if that distribution, if that mechanism of communication isn't strong, then what we end up with, and isn't effective, what we end up with is sun-dried tomatoes. What we end up with is other things filling in for inappropriate communication. So I think what's been happening, to come to the case of Turkey in its relationship with the Ottoman Empire, in the mid-20th century, there was an enormous drive to, the Ottoman Empire was terrible, now we're free, we're a modern country, and so on. But it was still a very powerful past through which one could have a narrative of greatness. You know, we had great battles, we won great wars, we are wonderful, which one gets in history classes. And that is a narrative that could have some documentary evidence, but I think that more and more, even though there's a huge amount of historical research that is excellent, right? There are a lot of people who are doing historical work, working with documents. They've been doing it for decades. But in public discourse, what do we see? We see Automania, we see TV shows, we see Franz Josef as sun-dried tomatoes and the Turkish equivalent. And I think most interestingly for me, there was a statue that went up in the city of Amasya in 2015, I think, which is of a young prince, sultan, with a camera taking a selfie. And it was put touristically, not to represent any particular sultan, but so that people would be there and take their own selfies with the selfie-taking sultan. And I think that that's a really important monument because it shows what people want from history. They want to show that they were in the place that was powerful, right? They want to show themselves hanging out with the celebrity sultan, right, who's taking a selfie. And so where's the archive there? It's not there. And so I think one needs to think about how does one work with archives and work with information to communicate as effectively as this fictive selfie-taking prince.
Thanks so much. I mean, you both already brought up so many themes that will be really important in this conversation. And in particular, the differentiation between concrete time and space and concrete research and concrete invocation of empire in a specific geographic and time and space context versus these large narratives that enable us to use it for presence or to consume it as well. So we can just continue with this conversation and then, yeah, move on.
Zizek, would you like to chime in? Or
I actually would like to follow up with what Wendy was saying about the communication of the knowledge that we produce. We tend to underestimate the kind of knowledge that we produce about the past, and we do that because we forget how important it is for humans to how important it is for humans to perceive the kind of futures that are available for us. The popularized neuroscience knowledge shows that the brain, the parts of the brain that are wired when we talk about memory and the past are almost, if not entirely similar, are very similar to those parts that are wired when we think about future. So our work as historians and those working on memory are actually more important than we usually think. So, and when we start thinking about empires, it's really crucial to have a differentiated idea of what we mean about the experience of the past, because it easily merges with the fantasies and the imperial imageries that we have, which leads very easy mapping out of the past into the future. So in order to be able to imagine different futures, we need to have a bit of a differentiated analysis of the empires and the imperial experience. That's where I can start.
Yeah. Both going to leap on what you just said. I love what you just said. And I just want to add one thing, which is that politicians and the public seem to be like, historians, they're sort of picking beans from the past, who cares? And at the exact same moment that they do that, they're making policies based on history. And what you said just points to the misrecognized importance of detailed historical analysis.
But see, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, because I don't think they're wrong. And I think that it's the same in my profession in art history as well. But I think a lot of art historians, I think a lot of historians write, on the one hand, the classic response that we might have as academics will always be to say, oh, but it's more complicated than that. And we all see just layers of grey on grey on grey, okay? But the problem is, if you're talking about a public discourse, if you're going past, then that's not going to get you anywhere. Even we may have all had that experience, even as professional academics, and I certainly have, of reading books that are turgid and unreadable. And that does no service at all. And the problem is that if we're talking about, the public function of academic art history or history or whatever, I think where its biggest challenge is to come up with narratives that are sufficiently powerful to be able to, I guess, undo or offer, counter narratives to those which we might see as so kind of seductive in the present, and we can think of, a particular set of narratives that seem to be, driving events in Ukraine at the moment. And that's where I think that, saying, well, we need to have a more differentiated, analysis. That's not going to get you. I don't think that gets us very far. Well, it certainly depends who your audience is, obviously. But for, policymakers or whoever, that kind of approach isn't going to get you very far. And I think there's a problem also with archives, because, we've all, archives have for time immemorial been plundered to legitimate this or that argument. So, archives aren't, obviously they're not a guarantee of anything in a way. And that doesn't mean they're not important, but nevertheless, they're always subject to selective reading. I'm not therefore saying, well, they don't matter, but I think we need to recognize that at the same time they're abused,
I'm not sure we're disagreeing.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for the disagreement part to come.
Well, because I'm just simply saying that I think that maybe we can be too concerned with putting together nuanced narratives which sometimes don't necessarily work. Or even you talked about information. I don't think it works actually.
I agree. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, my sense was also that you both called for a kind of new
agree
type of writing.
I think
because there is this long assumption that all you need to do is just tell people the information. And of course,
but I think that what Wendy was suggesting was about a form that this narrative should take.
Yeah,
so I think that you ultimately do agree.
In that case, I misread what you said. I do apologize. Yeah.
So let's hear also from Jeremy.
I might try to sort of approach this from a somewhat different angle, perhaps. So, like many of us, I've been particularly taken with the tragedy in Ukraine, even as I think it's also crucial to point out that there is a clear contrast between the way in which European publics are treating this tragedy as opposed to those in Syria, Ethiopia, and so on. But even this morning, I was listening to the BBC, and it was a variety of historians drawing, presumably on their archives, talking about how Putin seems like he wants to be a czar, and he's living in a 19th century world. You find this in Turkey fairly frequently. Erdogan is a sultan. And I think, I mean, this is also sort of moving ahead to some other topics that we're going to discuss, but it seems clear that oftentimes when we invoke those imperial metaphors, all that is really being pointed to is a sort of authoritarian form of rule that doesn't seem to abide by the imperatives of liberal democracy. And to some extent, empires become reduced to merely territorial ambition. I should say here, too, that I had a great oversight in my presentation. I didn't mention Annika Kirbis's project, which is a wonderful study of the forms of siege remembrance, the Ottoman sieges of Vienna, particularly the final siege of 1683. But in a way, this sort of stands in with, she writes about the right-wing identitarian movement in Austria, sort of all that, from their perspective, the Ottoman Empire is an invasive and intrusive force from outside fortress Europe, right? So what do we do with these circulating metaphors? Well, one thing, and I think this is returning to indeed, Matthew, what you raised in the beginning, is that not all empires have the same metaphorical capacity. So the Habsburgs are invoked in many strange ways that contrast with typically how the Ottomans and the Romanovs, for instance, are invoked, or for that matter, the British. You have this notion that somehow the European Union, with its multinational sort of deterritorialized bureaucracy, is like the Habsburgs, right? That's one of those cliches. I think what's important here is to distinguish clearly between the ways in which collective memories, which are really something in the present of empires, are being harnessed to narratives, to political narratives that we might find problematic on the one hand, and on the other hand, the forms of legacy, the forms of what Anne Stoller would call imperial duress, which are not necessarily picked up into collective memories, but still are also having effects in the present. So Ukraine is, of course, a fascinating and important place to think about this. On the one hand, there are collective memories of the Habsburgs and the Romanovs, and even the Ottomans, in fact, if you dig a bit, though those tend to be curated by Turkish actors frequently. On the other hand, you might say that indeed the fact that Ukraine and its current borders was once ruled both from Vienna and from St. Petersburg continues to have effects today that are not merely about collective memory, and we should take those seriously. So I'll stop there.
I think you bring up something really important, which is that when people are saying it's like the Tsars or it's like the Ottomans, this is said with the assumption that we're in a space of modernity which is naturally at peace and harmonious and correct somehow. And I think that the thing that people are searching for in the past is ultimately people are looking for the good. And if the speakers are saying the modern is the good, well, our lived reality is that many people have precarious jobs. We have horrible climate change. There are many wars going on in the world. And I think the immense instability in which we are living is something which is giving lie to this presumption of the modern. And one of the reasons that people are searching for the good in the past is that it's difficult to imagine the good in the future. And so the good is being assigned to a past that was imperial because somebody was in charge, supposedly. And so there's a search for the good, which is misdirected in both ways. And I think it's really interesting when you bring it up that way, because it's resting on a premise of modernity, which I see as a failed modernity in many ways.
May I jump in?
Sure.
Just here? I think the metaphor of empire actually in the political realm offers us the ability to form bigger platforms, political platforms, and bigger mobilizations. So, for instance, in Joyful Militancy, Carla Bergman and Nick Montgomery uses empire to define a web of control that exploits and administers life that includes interlocking and intersecting systems of settler colonialism, white supremacy, the state, capitalism, ableism, ageism, and heteropatriarchy. So in this case, for instance, the metaphor of empire brings all sorts of different struggles together in order to create a bigger umbrella organization. But when it comes to scholars like us, we also see that empire and colonial power regimes circulating widely to define different sort of power exploitation regimes nowadays. So it's not only a metaphor, it doesn't circulate only as a metaphor that helps nation states to express their imperial fantasies in bigger scales, drawing on the past experiences, but it also helps us to create bigger political mobilizations. But for scholars like us, we might need to be a bit more differentiated in our use of the imperial and colonial in our own analysis, maybe, because when we start talking about every kind of power exploitation in terms of it through the lenses of imperialism and colonialism, we miss the present, as you were stressing in a moment. So present just becomes a transitionary period between the past empire and the future empire. So as we see in the cases of Russia, as Jeremy rightly stressed, and Turkey. So in order to get a nuanced sense of what's happening in the present, I think we need to refrain a bit from the metaphors without ignoring its potency in the political realm.
I agree with you on that, and I think that the way these terms are often used in often a rather crude way, I agree with you, can be problematic. I guess in a way, partly it also highlights the fact that we lack an alternative vocabularies, for describing, particular kind of formations or situations or whatever, and so we just fall back on the language of colonialism or empire. I mean, classic case actually being the whole thing about, Austria-Hungary was an empire or not, because somebody like Peter Judson would say it wasn't. It doesn't fit into the classic description. So, it was nothing like the British Empire or the French Empire, or I'm sorry, I don't know about enough about the Ottoman Empire, but and so, but
though it's often lumped in with the Ottomans.
Yes, that's right.
And
Yeah,
the
actually,
Romanovs
maybe they had
as
certain similarities.
this,
Actually, yeah. But nevertheless, those kind of nuances get lost a bit, don't they? But I was going to ask a couple of things that you said. So, were you sort of implying that there's a kind of nostalgia for empire because, is it that sense that, well, everybody knew their place? Is that partly what it is? And it's out of a sense of being a kind of, a modernity in which everything is up in the air. I wouldn't call that a failed modernity. I would say that's modernity, all that is solid melts into air, so that's not necessarily... it's as if there is such a thing as a successful modernity. But is that kind of what you meant by the lure of empire, that this sense that... I certainly see it in Britain, how even now, and there's been a remarkable pushback in the last 10, 15 years, actually, people saying, it brought order, everybody knew where they were, and, it wasn't so awful after all. It's been quite extraordinary, that. Is that what you mean?
I think that maybe we need to differentiate between several things, which is that there's always a desire for the good, and I'm putting this really neutrally.
What do you mean by the good?
Everybody is having a good life where things are as good as they could possibly be. We've solved the problems of the past and moved to a better present. And I think that that's like any other regime. That's what the modern promises. And I think that we're living in an era of immense economic instability. In that economic instability and also climate instability, I think that the nostalgia that empire offers it's actually shifts, because when we're talking about empire, we're talking about a political structure. So people are looking for a kind of stability that we're not experiencing because of economy, and they're looking for it in a political framework, I wouldn't say everybody knew their place, but it gives a notion of somebody is in charge, there is stability, things are solid, and partially that sense of solidity is because in retrospect, people who lived 90 years, but 600 years ago, it seems like, they didn't do much in that 90 years. But for us, every day has lots of events, right? So I feel like people are creating a nostalgia for empire because it feels so solid, even though at the time empires were at war, they expanded, they receded, they had different political programs, rulers died, all kinds of stuff happened. But the notion of empire gives you this feeling of, boom, it was the Roman Empire. It was just there, it was good. And now we're a bling.
Does anybody...
Yeah, so we have two kind of different ways, maybe broadly seen to criticize the present by using the empire, whether saying, oh, there's an empire that shouldn't be there, we shouldn't have this system, or to project and say, oh, there is a discontent with modernity or discontent with the nation state, and nation state, for example, for failing to manage the difference, we look into the empire. I think that's a similar example to what you gave when you were first talking, and then look at other models, so we can also use the empire for that. And now when we are in the realm of this kind of more metaphorical approach, one such empire is also the sanitizing empire that we used in the title of this event. So what would this mean for you, and what do you think are some opportunities or limitation in using this concept of sanitizing the empire? Yep.
Well, I would just say, in the case of Turkey, it's really a weird relationship because Turkey likes to think about the Ottoman Empire, but it's an Ottoman Empire that's purely Turkish. And so it doesn't really include, unless it's thinking about its expansive mode, which it's had different political moments when Turkey has fantasized about re-expanding, at least economically. But the fantasy of the Ottoman is the grandeur that is also limited to the state. And so it's an empire that's also not an empire. It's considered within the nation-state model, which also ignores the multi-ethnicity that was inherent to the Ottoman Empire. And so there's an irony there, because sometimes I'm like, sure, please, let's be Ottoman, and half the population can be non-Muslim. Great, I'd love that. But that's not the fantasy. So I think that even defining what empire is very complicated, because it's not even about dynasty, it's about the power that is fantasized through the fantasy of dynasty and so on. So there are multiple levels of fantasy which often have absolutely nothing to do with the physicality, the spatial physicality or the population physicality of empire. It's just about they had fancy things and they lived well. I don't think that there's everybody also in that fantasy, everybody is a prince. Nobody is a farmer in that fantasy. And 99% of people in the past were farmers. So, it's an odd fantasy when you think about it.
I do think that with regard to the Ottomans, to the degree that neo-Ottomanism is a very instrumental discourse on the part of the powers that be in Turkey today, there is some protean shifting to it, so that you think about Hagia Sophia, the Reconquista of what was once the most famous church in Christendom and then became the most famous mosque in Ottomandom. That is clearly a sort of restorative, belligerent, homogenizing Turkish nationalist neo-Ottomanism. But you also have this sort of multicultural neo-Ottomanism, which Erdogan et al. Will occasionally voice when it seems politically convenient. So I've written myself about the Bulgarian church in Istanbul. And of course, buildings are easier to handle than people, but nonetheless, there is also this interest in sort of cultivating that sort of late 19th century, fin de siècle, Ottoman Istanbul multiculturalism on occasion, right? And we were talking even about some of the television shows that are revisiting these questions, and we might talk about that more. But I did want to make a few other points that I think will link a couple of the topics that we've been circling around. increasingly, and perhaps it is because of what's happening, the war in Ukraine at the moment, but increasingly I find myself feeling that empire, when it's invoked, particularly in broader media forums, really just becomes an alibi for what are seen to be the failures of the nation state in liberal democratic, vis-a-vis liberal democratic values and obligations, so that it's imperialist. Basically, irredentism is one of the easiest things to refer to. You know, territorially trying to reincorporate spaces based on ethno-national homogeneity, and yet irredentism, as we know, was originally really more of a nation-state phenomenon in Italy, as it achieved national coherence in the 19th century. So I think it's important that we not merely use empire as a metaphor for the failures of the liberal democratic nation state. And in that respect, sanitizing as a metaphor is useful because it draws attention to the ways in which, if we sanitize the past, we are in some sense removing the unruly, the disruptive, the troubling, and the potentially infectious aspects of the past. We're basically rendering it no longer contradictory and no longer uncanny. And I think holding out a place in which imperial pasts and other pasts can remain uncanny and can remain contradictory is quite important, because it's that I find both intellectually and politically inspiring.
Maybe,
Sorry.
maybe I can add one thing about the limitations of the metaphor, since you all talked about the offers.
Perhaps we should mention one of our questions at some point was about these metaphors, but we've really just moved into conversation at this point.
So, yes, the uncurated, uncanny, and those that are out of control, the things that are, the remains that are out of control are the remains of the past that are unsanitized, basically, and the ones that we see as part of the national narratives remain to be the sanitized parts of the empires. But there is also a difficulty that we faced in our last collection, Heritage Out of Control, that came out of a conference that we organized with Annika Kirbes and Seravit Debele. So we all dealing with the kind of heritage making practices that are trying to render visible the silenced fragments of the past. We most of us ended up working on the rubbles, on the wasted, abandoned remains of the imperial and colonial regimes. So there is also this obstacles of matching categories, places, and the type of objects with certain topics. So if we are looking for unsanitized past, that's what you deal with. So you deal with rubbles. So I think maybe taking a way of transcending this obstacle would be trying to dismatch this kind of categories, the conceptual categories and approaches with certain objects, and try to read against the grains the sanitization practices that we also have. So in order to reach certain type of unsanitized fragments of the past, we don't maybe need to only grapple with the rubbles and the waste.
Just maybe in addition to that, I was thinking as you were talking about people who are from regions that were colonized from other places, and that nostalgia in that sense often, in contrast to the ideology of post-colonial theory, often also includes a positive nostalgia for things like British tea and cricket and literature. And, that is, I know people who are from Nigeria and Kenya and India who appreciate aspects of empire, particularly in an earlier generation, particularly in a generation that was educated more in tune with the imperial system. And I think it's really interesting to think about how nostalgia and nationalism play against each other, not only in places like Turkey that were the epicenters of earlier colonies, but also how the response to colonialism is differentiated. Also in the areas that were colonized, in which nationalism hasn't necessarily brought the good. And so there's a search, which isn't to say people are like, oh yes, please colonize us, but sometimes I know some people in the former Soviet republics who are saying, well, things were better in the Soviet Union. That doesn't mean they want to go back to being colonized by the Soviet Union, but it means that the promise of the nation often doesn't pan out as expected, and often, again, I think it's really important to separate the economic platform in which people are experiencing their lives and experiencing disappointment, let's say, and the search for a political solution which looks like it's in the past, but it's a misreading of the past.
I think that's an important point, actually, the idea that, yeah, it's often the failure of the promise of the nation that came after it, which can be a driving force. Obviously, the problem with that is that it not with what you're saying, obviously, but the problem with that is that it's often based on it depends on what you attribute that failure to, quite clearly, yes. But can I also come to the question of sanitizing, though? Because I wonder if that in itself, you have to use it very carefully, because it implies, doesn't it, that there's something like the unsanitized version. And I would say that doesn't exist, all you have is different interpretations from the point of view of different actors under, different kind of ideological projections or whatever. So although we might use the term sanitization, I think it's one that has to be used very carefully, because it does kind of hold the promise that, put that to one side, and let's look at the rubble, how it really was, and you can never find that. There never is how it really was. We're going back to Ranke, aren't we? There,
Yeah.
and that the point is, all you have is just different versions. And I would even say that the motif of reading against the grain has itself become such a cliche in history that it's no longer reading against the grain is what people do, so it's no longer against the grain. It's the orthodox approach, And I find that art historians are always saying, I'm going to read this artwork against the grain, and it's sort of, no, you're not, because there isn't no grain anymore. There isn't a grain. You are the grain, and you're just, I think we do have to just be careful, I think, with the metaphor of sanitized histories, because, quite clearly it happens. We know that, don't we? But nevertheless, how much weight we want to give that, I think we have to be careful of.
Yes.
I was just going to say, in relation to the nature of the archives, what I always find really interesting is that I'm looking for something and I always find the information that's right beside it. And I never find the thing I'm actually trying to find. And I think that for me is a huge metaphor, that the fact of my desire is a problem there, right? And that's also inevitable, because otherwise I wouldn't be there in the first place. But I think that one of the things I find really interesting, and it's a different way of thinking about history, is how can we fill in the gap towards what we're looking for and use that to find information? And what I mean by that is, I was really struck by the headdress that Jeremy showed us at the very beginning, because here it is in an ethnographic museum. It's an object. It has two kinds of coins. But what I was thinking about is, what was the experience of the woman who wore this? And it's there. Is she aware of these coins? Does she use these coins? How did those coins get rubbed out that way? And in that narrative, we actually have the human experience of moving between political and economic systems, which is fairly complex. And while I can identify that headdress as a headdress and think about the coins when they were minted and so on, actually the history I want is the experience of that woman wearing the headdress, under what circumstances, and so on. And
you're not the first person to raise that. And of course, since I'm using this as a sort of metaphorical emblem for the project, I can only plead ignorance. But it's a really important question.
But I mean, the thing is that that's the reason we're going to the archive. And I could say that also for the documents in an archive. I think that this comes up all the time because every piece of evidence is a remainder, but it doesn't have agency. And earlier, Yelena and I were talking about literature, because it's literature that gives people, or film, or it's our creative impulses that give objects that agency. And for me, what has become really interesting is thinking about how we can use forms that are fictive in order to frame forms that are evidence-based like this. And I think this is going to what Matthew was also saying in relation to the first question, is that we need better tools of communication in order to make evidence have value. And one of the reasons is because everybody will be interested in the woman wearing the headdress if we present her well enough, or many more people will be interested in that woman's experience than probably in the coins.
So this is actually a great segue to the next question, because Matthew, you explicitly mentioned art history, and this is something that we really wanted to ask you about. And it goes really kind of follows what you were talking about, and I will also cite you from before. They had fancy things. Art historians have this special and different relationship to history and memory because they bring the aesthetic into the picture, and on some level, there are also claims that artwork, especially the famous ones, such as Mosque by Sinan or Klimt's painting, tell us something more essential about the empires than written sources. But this is, of course, an approach full of potential pitfalls as well. So how do you see the role of art history in mediating the memory of empire to the broader public?
I mean, I'm kind of an anti-art history art historian, so I'll just start with that. I mean, art history, as it has traditionally emerged, is deeply tied to the verification of the truth of the nation state, and therefore it has a structure in which, as you said, it chooses successful objects that have not been lost to time and uses them to string together a narrative. That means you skip over eras with wars for quite frequently. Now, part of the problem with this has been that for most people, especially outside of art history, the notion of art history is one of the longue durée, in which you have a long history of art, in which you have a narrative arc, and for many people, I would say globally, that is also a narrative arc of so-called Western civilization, which is a fiction that was sort of made extremely prominent through the historical imagination / philosophy of Hegel. And that structure sort of stays dominant in the popular discourse because that's how textbooks function. But I think that within the discipline of art history, there are many people who work with lost objects, destroyed objects, objects as reconceived by contemporary artists, things that were made in war, were temporary, and so on. So I think that in every discipline, one needs to have a big differentiation between the traditional arc that is how people get an introductory course and the ways in which art historians use tools like historiography in order to at least become aware of the ideological structuring that's inside of those narratives. Now, the thing that I find the essential, which perhaps is in the process of happening, but I don't think it's really happened yet, which is once you've sort of critiqued a story historiographically, if you don't have a new story to tell, people keep saying the same old story. And so then you get to a point of art history I find it extremely important as a discipline because it conveys many essential elements of modernity, such as the necessity to interpret the world through materiality and through wealth, the necessity to interpret the world through secular knowledge and a secular episteme, and, as I said, the nation state. So it's a conveyor of ideology, and therefore it's really important. But the question is, if those aren't the values that one wants to convey, then what is art history? And that requires a huge imaginative shift, which, you know, that's sort of where I have been working more recently.
Yeah, well, I guess that there are two slightly different issues there. Mm-hmm. One of them is the way that artworks function as documents. And I don't think that's art history, actually. I mean, and you can tell when historians write about artworks, you can tell they're historians, not art historians.
They just use it as illustrations.
They use them as illustrations, that's right, yeah. But that's not to say, you know, and that's perfect, that's fine, you know, of course, why not? And often, I mean, artworks, buildings as well, well, you know, they can become potent sites of memory because, you know, because, you know, they can almost become sites of sort of condensation of all sorts of symbolic meanings because they're visible there, you know, they have a kind of palpable sense of presence there, and that's why they are, you know, you mentioned Klimt, you know, that's why I guess, you know, even now, you know, that you've got the kind of cult of Klimt there because there's something about his works which, at first sight, enable them to kind of, as a kind of condensed symbol of something about, you know, turn of the century Viennese culture, but at the same time, obviously, there's a different kind of art history in which, well, I mean, in one sense, you could say it's rather kind of old-fashioned notion of a kind of an autonomous history of art, where it's talking about something different. And I don't necessarily see it as automatically linked to the nation-state, although there has been a kind of, obviously, a close relationship to that. But when you think of certain narratives about, you know, the history of art being the conquest of beauty, for example, or the conquest of representational fidelity, you know, or whatever. That's not necessarily tied to the nation state, and you get these kinds of meta narratives. You know, you can think of ones related to modern art as well, which are even though certain places become privileged, you know, Paris, for example, or Berlin, but I don't think that narrative is necessarily tied to legitimization of the nation state. But obviously, but I guess probably for our discussion, it's probably the former that's more interesting, isn't it? The way that artworks function as illustrations of something, you know, and therefore become sites of memory as well. And they become very powerful ones, you know, and they can serve as props for all sorts of narratives, you know. It's one of the things that's always kind of always surprises people, almost striking, is how, you know, one sense in which you can talk about, you know, the Habsburg Empire as having been a kind of cultural space is that wherever you go, the architecture all looks the same, doesn't it? You know, you go to Rijeka or Zagreb or Ljubljana or Brno, you know, it's all the same, you know, and that's deliberate as well.
The theatres are all built by
the theatres are all built by that's right. Yeah. You know, and that serves a really important function, you know. You know, so yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Could I chime in here, or are we really running short on time?
We are really, for the sake of time,
because
this is a public
long,
conversation, and it is now really time to open the floor also to the questions from the audience.
Pity. No.
Yes.
Okay, so let's start with Patrick. Okay, Patrick.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm up there. Good. Yes, I'm Patrick Eisenloh. I'm an anthropologist at the Center for Modern Indian Studies here at the University of Göttingen, and I've really been enjoying your conversation and really So this is actually, my question is really about the media of memory, something that you've talked about when it came to legacies of plurality in former imperial spaces that are often erased. But you were mainly talking about it as a matter of communicating to a wider public, right? That where, for example, the archive and scholarly discourse really has no impact whatsoever. The kind of narratives and memories that resonate in public are rather those that feel good and feel empowering, and professional standards of truth and evidence are more normally irrelevant, right? But I'm really thinking about the recent book by anthropologist Charles Hirschkind, The Feeling of History, which is about Andalusia and the Muslim legacy of Al-Andalus. And here, actually, and his book is not just an impassioned plea for the inclusion of Muslims in Europe and a critique of the long-standing excision of Muslims from Europe, which is also in the post-imperial spaces that you were talking about, also a very pertinent topic. But his book is actually an attack on scholarship itself. It's actually an attack on the professional, secular historians of medieval Iberia and their methods. And he is actually making a case for aesthetic methods such as sonorous memory, especially taking musical traditions like flamenco seriously in scholarship as an alternative epistemology and method, right, of dealing with the past and its legacy. So it's about a fundamental transformation away from the archive of written documents, more to other aesthetic methods. And of course, as art historians, you might be friendly to that. So I was wondering, I certainly have my own opinion about that, and also on this book, which I really like a lot, but I also think it's not unproblematic. So really my question is, what do you think about it?
So just for the sake of time, because there are a lot of people wanting to ask questions, let's group them at least 2 by 2. So Karen Schoenwalder.
Hi, I'm Karen Schönwelder of the Max Planck Institute here in Göttingen. The research group whose results we're discussing here today, I mean, you focused on the presence of empires in particular, and I wonder whether you, Jeremy Zizek, maybe could say a bit more about differences between the presence of empires and the presence of nation state or other formations, historical formations in the present, because a lot of what has been discussed to me seemed to apply to the presence of history more generally. But there must be something specific, you assume, to empires, yeah? And I've been thinking about, is it the fact that empires are over? Yeah, they belong to the past, that they were temporary, that they were controversial. I mean, they have people who imagine themselves as being at the center of empires and others who imagine themselves to be oppressed, or something totally different. Maybe you could comment on that a bit.
Okay, so let's start with these 2 questions. Wendy.
So I have to read that book. I haven't read it. It sounds really, really interesting. I think in the case of medieval Iberia, it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of modern historical practice in relation to Spain was done under the regime of Franco's Spain. And so there's a very close relationship with establishing the Catholic nation in Spain and the historical legacy, which is specific to Spain's history. And in terms of using other aesthetic forms to understand, I think that what becomes interesting, that's actually what one of my most recent books deals with, is rethinking and thinking of poetry as a structure, poetry, also music, as structures through which to understand culture rather than history. And I think at that point, one really needs to think about what is a historicist episteme? What does that mean as something that emerges in the 19th century as a dominant way of coming to this thing that we call culture in the 20th century? How does that interface with anthropological ways of looking at culture? And what are these disciplinary formulations through which we're trying to approach something? That is, one always talks about, the historian's culture and the anthropologist's culture, and they're not the same culture. Why are we making these weird subdivisions and applying them to I don't know, the 10th century. That's a bizarre thing to do. So I think that there's an epistemic thing which is really important there. And at that moment, we need to think, okay, how does the episteme of historicity change? Because history and the archive are deeply intertwined. And that doesn't mean one needs to throw away all of the archive, but it may mean that the questions we're asking need to be formulated less through our disciplinary epistemes. And thank you for that. And the other question wasn't for me.
Can I just that sounds like a really interesting book. I mean, there has been a sort of debate amongst art historians. I mean, one of the common criticisms that's been made is that art history tries to kill off its objects. It doesn't convey a sense of the object as an aesthetic artifact. And there have been various different figures, writers, who've tried to sort of reintroduce that sense that art history is also about an aliveness, sensitivity. I have to say, I find most of those authors, I find their work unreadable. Because what it ends up doing is that it ends up reducing it just to a matter of personal aesthetic response on the part of the author. And as a result, then it no longer becomes a matter of a kind of collective discussion, because it's sort of like, well, if that's how you feel, if that's what you think about it, how can that, triangulate with anything else, So I think that's I do think, in a way, there is a sort of crisis maybe in art history, because it's not, I don't think it's kind of, not maybe in the way people talk about the crisis, because I think it's not relevant in a way it used to be, because, scholars writing in the 40s and 50s, even 30s and 20s, I'm not remotely suggesting let's write like them, but nevertheless they were able to connect to a broader public, which I think academic art history doesn't do now, and that's for all sorts of reasons. The nature of the public has changed, but I think also, it's almost become a standard kind of part of the kind of rhetoric of art history that we invoke all sorts of technical, pseudo-theoretical terms which alienate audiences, I think, and that's part of the problem, I think, as well, But I still remember Gombrich, who might be familiar, Ernst Gombrich, said that when Max Dvorak, who was this kind of quite an important Czech art historian, when he died in 1921, he was based in Vienna, actually, but when he died, it was like public mourning, this was like a catastrophe, and he was saying, my parents, they came in, and it was on the newspaper, Max Dvorak is dead, and the house was silent. There was no way that would happen now, with an art historian, and that's because I think, the reasons are complex, but I think that it's an interest. It may be to do with the failure of rhetoric, the kinds of discourses that we use.
Thank you, Karen, for the question. I think you are very right. I mean, we really need to differentiate the evocations of history and making certain fragments of past visible in the present from the evocations of empire, because every kind of recollection of the past is not imperial past. But in Turkey now, in contemporary Turkey now, it's a pressing issue because of the government's systematic use of imperial past in certain ways that revealed itself in the emblematic example of conversion of Hagia Sophia. So it reveals itself in the form of erasure of certain pasts in a systematic way that is of course enabled by the denial regime. So we are talking about a nation state that still officially denies the Armenian genocide, and which opens up the doors to erasures of certain historicities that highlights and makes visible certain presence of diversity and difference. So in that sense, empire has been a different, let's call it metaphor for now, in different parts of history. For instance, when we look at the cultural politics of 1990s, we see that there has been a depiction of the empire as a place of peaceful coexistence without answering the question of what happened to those subjects who have been part of the peaceful coexistence. Where are they? And what happened to their so-called abandoned property? So, but now what we see is pretty different than the cultural politics of 1990s. It is the complete erasure and silencing of the presence of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups. But what remains similar is the absences that we inherit from that past. So the denial regime basically makes possible to inherit certain absences, which comes together, which makes possible certain types of erasures that we are facing today.
Okay, Farhan.
Great. So I've got a few questions from our online chat. 3 if you can manage them, but I think maybe pick and choose as you'd like. And I'm just going to take a little bit of liberty in rephrasing them. Because the first, Wendy, I think comes back really nicely to that comment that you made of, everybody imagines themselves back into the past as a prince, not a farmer. And, it's almost sort of a request for elaboration that are there sort of forms of post-imperial commemoration or sort of reinvocation that do allow sort of more marginal subjects to sort of make that move, How exactly is that sort of laundered in a way, right? Because that's sort of no mean feat on some level. And then the second one is asking about sort of the linkage between post-imperial melancholy and gender, especially sort of in that kind of, the countervailing, what is sometimes imagined as the countervailing movement into modernity was also sometimes imagined as, arc of emancipation for women and a sort of threat to men's power. And so then what are the sort of entries or blockages for women around gender today? And then the last one is more specifically focusing on Turkey. That, do you think that there's a relationship between sort of the rise of the image of the common man in the political imagery and kind of these sort of new nostalgias for the Ottoman Empire?
Thank you so much, Farhan. I will just ask you all to be brief because due to recording, we can't actually go over time, but we can continue our conversation after the event.
Okay, so I think that a lot of this is tied into discussions of class and the non-discussion of class. So the issue with Tayyip Erdogan is that he is famously not from an upper-class background, and his family was an immigrant into Istanbul. In the early Republican period, most people who participated in the state were part of the existing urban elite for many generations. And that that began to break down in the 80s, but he is the first huge, well, not the first, but his class is a huge issue. So to think of him as a sultan is also saying he has no right to be a sultan because he is the common man. This obviously speaks to the desire of the common man. And so I think that it creates the fantasy of everybody being equal in a society that actually has had a fair amount of economic mobility in earlier periods through education, but that hasn't been functioning as well. So it, I think, is a discursive answer to a process of mobility which hasn't been present in recent decades. And again, the ideological making up for the economic failure. In relation to gender, Turkey had very famously an enormous top-down feminism in the Republican period, which enabled women to participate enormously in the public sphere, but did not integrate discussions of the private sphere. Discussions of the private sphere have increased from grassroots level from the 1980s, basically in the same period that people who weren't part of the urban upper classes were also able to have a public voice. So I think that there is an aspect of irredentism and moving back to a masculine-dominated space that is present in the articulation of the empire, but one actually doesn't see a lot of imagery about women in the harem and things like this. I think that it's played out, unfortunately, much more in the rise of femicide and which has been, unfortunately, a very big recent problem, of course, not just in Turkey, but in several countries globally. So again, how does that tie into shifting economics and so on? I think there's an aspect of it, but I think what really has shifted in Turkish feminism, as far as I can see it, is a shift from this state-run, top-down feminism of the early Republican period towards what's now a very grassroots, very courageous struggle for women's rights. And that is getting a kind of pushback. But I don't know if that's so much part of the Ottoman discussion. Yeah.
Something very briefly about the issue of gender, actually, which is, it arose out of research that I was doing with my colleagues on museums. And, the process of modernization meant a backward move in relation to the participation of women in museums. Because in the early history of early formation of museums, whether it's in Budapest or Vienna or wherever, women were actually quite important participants as collectors, as participants in the kind of organization of museums. And then, of course, what you have in the later 19th century is kind of professionalization, and you don't want amateurs involved in the museum, and of course the professions are predominantly male. And so, you could therefore kind of almost imagine a kind of an imperial sort of fantasy, which is about restoring. Admittedly, these were aristocratic women, so it's important not to kind of have some kind of false image of the past. But nevertheless, there was a space actually for women to be active, social participants or participants in cultural organizations that was then cut out actually later as you had a move towards, ultimately towards the modern nation state.
Thank you.
I haven't been able to respond to any question yet. Sorry. I know we're running late, but I think if there's one great lacuna in the work that we've tried to do, it is indeed the class politics of post-imperial memory. And so that's an idea for a further project. As far as the gendering of imperial pasts is concerned, well, that's a huge topic, but I do think it's fascinating that there's been, and this is now opening another topic that we haven't really discussed, but the way in which women characters, and of course gender is not only women, but the way that women characters in serials, the neo-Ottoman Turkish serials in Turkey, but even in an earlier moment, the way that Sisi can no longer be remembered as Sisi because she's Romy Schneider in Central Europe. But now Sisi is Sisi again because Romy Schneider is not remembered. So there's much to be done there, but we're going to have to stop, I know.
Thank you so much. I mean, time flies and we're having a wonderful conversation, and I can't imagine a more wonderful conversation to close the project than this one. And I really thank all the panelists, Wendy from Matthew Rampli, Cicek Ilangis, Jeremy Walton. I thank the audience as well as our online audience. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.